So this video is going to begin what serves as Romans' main conclusion, at least as far as Paul cares about the argument. And so we'll be looking at the beginning of chapter 11, particularly 11 verses 1 through 12. If you want to kind of get the context, back up to 10:14 to do that and read through 11:12, or even maybe through the entirety of chapter 11. As this is like, if this is his main idea, it would do good to read it several times to kind of let the whole thing sink in. So take a pause and do that. Thanks. All right, welcome back. So Paul in chapter 11 is going to set up a sort of worst case scenario. God's righteousness is satisfied. So at minimum, he's going to kind of do the minimum case. He's going to kind of do similar to back in chapter 9, where he saw Jacob have a loved, Esau have a hated, that, and Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and that, at minimum, God is just if he made some vessels for destruction, because that's his business. We're going to see the minimum case, but we're going to see Paul isn't happy to stay in the minimum. So he's going to range from a pretty dismal view of the promises of Israel that he says God would still be faithful if he only did this. But here's what I'm holding out hope for. So remember, Paul is all about hope. He's going to start with, I have complete faith in God. He's going to at least be like this, and he'd be totally faithful and we'd have exactly what we deserve. But I think it's going to be a lot more than that. So we'll start out looking in chapter 11 here. So let's look at it. I asked then, has God rejected his people? He's like, his people, like right above the verse, you saw, and at the end of chapter 10, he's like, they have heard and heard and heard, and it hasn't sunk in. They have not accepted the actual proclaim Jesus as Lord, which is the only way to save. So if that's the only way for everyone to be saved, and they aren't doing that, does that mean God rejected Israel? By no means. As Paul always does, he's got these rhetorical questions. He wants to make sure you know the rhetorical. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. So he starts out, worst case scenario, I'm a part of Israel, and I'm proclaiming Jesus like literally right now. So maybe it's just me. Now he doesn't really mean this. This is a sort of rhetorical flourish, but he has that, and he's like, it could be that much, and he gives some examples from the Old Testament. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew, because I'm his people. How do you not know that Scripture says of Elijah? This is back in the Book of Kings. How he appeals to God against Israel is when Elijah is surrounded by Ahab and Ahab's wife, who's a Baal worshiper, and all of Israel's rejected, and the prophets of God are being persecuted, and he's being hunted, and he's like, he cries out to God, Lord, they've killed your prophets, they've demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. I'm the last one, God, and they're trying to kill me. And then God said, what did God say? I've kept for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to the Baal. So God said, nah, I just you. There's like 7,000 of you that are still fine. So not great, but he's saying at this time, there are times in the past where the promises of God that were to be to all of Abraham's descendants, the promises to Israel, the promises that God has done, were as small as 7,000 people left that were not rejecting him. So Paul's doing this. I feel like I'm alone sometimes, but I know plenty of other Jewish Christians. So maybe there's like 7,000 of us that really accept Jesus, and maybe that's it. So maybe God's promises to Israel are fulfilled by the small number of Jewish Christians that there are. For what is God's reply to him? I've kept 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. That there's like some remnant left that God has chosen to not reject Jesus, and they've come to Jesus, and by God's grace and providence, it's clicked for them and it didn't click for somebody else, and so they're that maybe that's it. Paul's not going to be happy with this, so kind of look at this as like the messianic the Jewish believer in Jesus way of figuring out how to fulfill the promises of the Old Testament. Um, but if it is by grace, it is no longer the basis of works, so they're not trusting in the law anymore. It's what God did that mattered. Grace would not be grace if it was trusting in works anymore. So even the Jewish Christians are still not bound by works of law, such as what might be in the air for the debates that Paul's going to nose into in the back part of Romans. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. He said, so did Israel fail to get what it was seeking? It was looking after God for all these centuries, and did they just fail to miss it? It's like those that God wanted to found it, and the rest were hardened. And again, this is that sort of vessels chosen for destruction idea that, again, is a minimum. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And that's pretty sure that's Kings. All right. And then David says, this is in the Psalms, let their table become a snare and a trap. Like, the good things they have is going to be a trap, a stumbling block, and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. So maybe that's it. Maybe it's the vessels for destruction to highlight how good God is so God can show off his grace and God be glorified. Maybe. And if Paul says maybe, we take him as word. This chapter is Paul is not given an answer. It's almost like Job and his suffering. At the end, Job doesn't know why he suffered. He has to just accept God's wisdom. Paul is having to come to a place like Job and it's serving his wisdom and how this happens. And he's serving a role model for us for the same thing, that we can have questions and we know that, well, it could be this, it could be this. And we know no matter what, God is good. And that's going to be kind of what Paul is doing here. And it's like, I'm not real happy with this. I hope it's better than this, but God's still good if it's this. And I got to know that. And it's better than I think it is. So I asked, did they stumble so that they might fall? So Israel was set up to stumble, it sounds like. And it's like, did they stumble so that they would crash? It says, by no means. God's better than that. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles so as to make Israel jealous. And so here's Amia's theory. He said earlier in the prophecies in the end of chapter 10 that the Gentiles of foreign nations aren't real nations, are going to make them jealous. He's saying that's what God's doing here is they stumbled so that the gospel would spread, so that Jews, and you can think of this maybe follow if you read through the book of Acts to get the timeline of it all. It was persecutions in Jerusalem that pushed the church into the Gentiles, and Paul's seen that. He's also seen it in city after city where he's gone to synagogues first. Every once in a while it goes well, but usually what he does then is he has to go to the streets. And he went fully intending to preach to Israel first. It was actually easier. They had the same Old Testament. They had a very nice head start. But then he had to go to the Gentiles instead. And so he's saying he's seen this as action that the nations, that the fulfillment that they've been waiting on for Abraham to be blessing all the nations is actually happening as he writes this, which is exciting to do, something that you've been waiting for thousands of years for. It's like, oh, this is happening like today, like right now. And he's actually got a boatload of people and money going back to be blessings to the nations. If you read the end of the book of Isaiah, it talks about the nations bringing offerings to Israel to help them, and he's bringing offerings from all the Eastern Mediterranean that are followers of God's Messiah back to Jerusalem. And he's like, that came from this rejection. There is purpose here. I don't know what all the purpose is, but I've seen at least this purpose. And his hope now is as prophesied that these Gentile Christians might make them jealous, and actually he's hoping maybe literally that'll happen. The main offering he's bringing isn't the bags of silver to the famine in Jerusalem. It's the righteously converted people who have great relationship with God and faith that he's hoping will be like, these Gentiles have a better relationship with God than I do. Maybe there's something to this Jesus. He's hoping that that will be the witness that changes it. He will be disappointed in this. That is not what actually happens when this happens. The book of Acts, written a bit later than the book of Romans, is fairly silent on the offering. It may have even been a painful subject. It fell so flat. But Paul's right to hope that that or something like that will happen. And we don't know. It's in God's hands. But somehow God's going to work this rejection to good. Because God works all things together for the good of those who love him, one. And God's a God who keeps his promises. And if it's not for their sake that he's doing it, it's for the sake of the promises he's made, and because he's a God that loves. He says, now if their trespass means riches for the world, he's saying if a whole world's coming to know the God of Israel because of their rejection, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will the full inclusion mean? He's like, at some point, he expects Israel to come to God, and he'll explore that in the next section. At some point, he expects that to happen. When that happens, he's like, maybe that'll be when God fixes everything in the world, and that'll be it. And you see, he's got this like huge, like second coming expectations. Maybe going back to chapter 8, this period of labor pains that the world is in, where all creation wastes and groans, but groans with it, the birth that we're waiting on that makes it all worth it, maybe that'll be it. And so that's the hope, the sort of that Jesus' kingdom will come. And so we're going to kind of get him to flesh that out and kind of think that out in the next few videos. But that's it for today. Thank you.